Beyond the headlines. This is World Insight.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. I'm at the venue of the 2026 Summer Davos. Chinese Premier Li Qiang on Wednesday delivered a special address at the opening plenary of the Summer Davos. He said China's innovation is earned through years of strengthening its own capabilities and relentless hard work. It has also been driven by widespread application across industries and cultivated through a robust ecosystem. The Chinese premier also said China Opportunity 2.0 represents comprehensive innovation-driven empowerment and high-return investment prospects. Earlier, I moderated a joint forum between CGTN and the World Economic Forum, themed Resisting Autarky, to discuss how we could find the right balance between protecting national interests while continuing to seek economic collaboration around the world. And here are the panelists. The world is getting ever more complex, as we these days always say. Wars, conflicts, plus innovation. These are bringing new possibilities, but at the same time, new challenges to many on the global supply chains and many businesses around the world. So, are we seeing today just a temporary phenomenon of the so-called national security as the priority, or this is already settling down to be the theme for all of us for years to come? Professor An.
I think I would start by pointing out the rather surreal nature of the title of this session, because I think if we imagine 10 years ago, if you had a session at the World Economic Forum with the word autarky, I think many people might react with, what is that? Because it's a word we have abandoned into the history books of planned economy. So it's quite a statement of our times that this word has been brought back. But I would caution against the idea that we can balance trade integration and autarky, that we can be dependent without being vulnerable. And to use an analogy that is actually right in front of me, I would ask everyone a question. Can you open and close the door at the same time? And some people might say, yeah, sure, you can open it halfway. But if you think about it in our regular lives, we don't open the door halfway because it's the worst of both worlds. It doesn't keep you safe, and you might just bruise yourself because you keep running into a half-open door. And if we look at the real world around us today, tariffs, export controls, investment screening.
And the list goes on.
And the list goes on. They often backfire. And tariffs have not helped to reduce trade deficits. They have increased costs. Export controls can ironically spur indigenous innovation on the other side. And so I'll be very careful about making this assumption that we are able to have it both ways.
What about for you, Mr. Klein? Your thoughts on the general question, can you open the door and close the door at the same time?
I think the reason that autarky, or to use a less triggering word, self-sufficiency has become more popular over the past few years is because there have been many events globally that make people feel unsafe, and that a lot of the assumptions they had about how the global economy could function well have been undermined. I think it started really most acutely with the pandemic, when a lot of things people took for granted, their ability to access material goods, they couldn't get them because transportation was, factories were shut down, or transportation was not available, or there were limited shortages of things people needed.
We hope we can graduate from that 10 years as soon as possible, right?
If you are feeling unsafe, it's a price to pay. You could call it closing a door halfway or what have you, but I think it is a reasonable response to get what I would think of as buying insurance.
Mr. Sasaki.
Yes. As a consultant, I have visited more than 15 countries, and I met more than 100 CEOs, I think, bilateral meeting, and then particularly in this region. And then my sense is, I think that everyone understands that nothing is predictable. That is a really common sense among the business leaders. I think this uncertainty remains for the time being. But at the same time, I feel that strong sense of entrepreneurship. Even that everything is unpredictable, they need to survive, and they need to be entrepreneurial. They need to redesign that and what they are doing, I think, in a smart way. So that is a reality on the business front. Nothing is predictable. That is where we are today. Yeah.
I love that philosophical answer. Of course, you need to provide the details a bit later.
Yes.
Yes. I'd love to hear more. And Professor Thurbong, your thoughts on that?
I think it's true, obviously. Geostrategic security is the overarching lens through which so many countries are viewing their economic engagement at the moment, and that is having a quite negative impact, obviously, quite detrimental impact. But geostrategic security, military security is just one dimension of security. There are many other dimensions of security that urgently require our attention, and I hope that we will focus on these dimensions of security going forward. Energy security is obviously important, but also social security, creating good jobs, which is also really important in terms of avoiding political polarization. Environmental security. It's crucial that we have a huge focus on environmental security. This geostrategic conflict is taking place in the context of the existential challenge of climate change. So the question really isn't, will security diminish, but will we find a way to think about balancing and perhaps reconciling these competing dimensions of national security? I think at the moment there has been a tendency to view these in terms of trade-offs. You can't have energy security and economic competitiveness, or you can't have economic competitiveness and job creation. And so there's been this focus on kind of managing trade-offs. But actually the real governance challenge, I think, across the globe is how do you actually govern in a way that advances economic, environmental, energy, social and geostrategic security simultaneously. I think that's the challenge for governments. It's not an easy challenge, but that's where we could productively focus our attention.
That's a great point. It's not just black and white, it's rather how you manage it comprehensively. Can business community communicate with the policymakers, have good results at this moment? Are they depending on that to have solutions?
I think dependent is not the right word, but that they fully understand the collaboration, cooperation with the nation-state government is becoming more and more critical. I think that's a mandate. One key example is supply chain. Thinking about that, key critical inputs like semiconductors, raw materials, and others. I think they all need to think about that, how much they can be efficient in the past. Concentration has been that one key dogma for the business leaders, but today they need to diversify. But to some extent, diversification, I think that it depends on the context, it depends on the situation. So they need to be adaptive, they need to be flexible. That's also the reality. They can't determine that this should be the right degree of the so that's a reality, and then they are thinking. And then in that context, cooperation with the government is really, really critical because they need to shape the agenda, not only for their own company, but also for the industry and but for the state.
A few adjectives: flexible, they need to be adaptive.
Yes.
That costs like billions of dollars.
Yes. If possible, that business leaders can think that the mid to long term basis, so that they can optimize, even if that there's ups and downs of the trend. That is a key thing. But I think it depends on that what type of the corporate governance you are running. But hopefully that will be one foundation. Then they can think not only just that single year analysis, but the multi-year analysis, how they can optimize. Even if there's ups and downs in the political stage, they can normalize in good way. And then one more thing is, no great CEOs think that stability is given. That is not given. They need to shape the agenda by themselves, more the spontaneity. I think that more actively. And that shift, I think I've clearly observed, I think that change over the last 6 years, 6 months, yeah.
Yue, your thoughts on that? Do you see businesses are really figuring out a solution of being flexible and adaptable? Or actually they are facing with new questions every day?
If we want to look for lessons, we actually would have to look to small nations for lessons. Because for big nations, they have easy access to geo-economic tools. They can impose tariffs, export controls, but if you think about it, the vast majority of countries in this world just cannot have access to these options. Autarky is off the table from the very start. The options that we have should not just be limited to geo-economic tools autarky, but actually thinking outside the door, if we could continue with that analogy.
I love your analogy of saying the outside door concept, but that leads to the question, how do we define the role of the government? And then my understanding, nothing has changed the responsibility of the government, I think, at least, I mean, over the years. I think government is responsible for the social welfare, I think infrastructure. I think that hasn't changed. Large state, small state, that hasn't changed at all. But what has changed over the last 6 months is because of the export control, because of the energy crisis. It's beyond that. How do we set that, the role of a government beyond that, the traditional scope? I think that is a way I interpret. And then that is based on the discussion with the business leaders. And then they start thinking that, okay, this is really, really attacking my own business. And then I need to collaborate with the government. Otherwise, I can't survive. That's a true voice I heard. So fundamentally, they trust that their own government. That's why they are making that their business in each state. But I think the situation has changed a lot. Right. And then how much I can step further to strengthen my position in collaboration with the government. I think that will be the key theme I have in my mind.
This is a really interesting observation about the role of the government and it not having changed. I mean, from sitting from an Australian perspective, I think this is really the key question that we are asking ourselves, because for a very long time, it's been understood in my country that the role of the government is simply to provide an adequate framework of rules in which the free market can operate. And it's not the business of the government to get involved in thinking about the industrial structure of the nation. It doesn't matter if we produce potato chips or computer chips. We'll let the market sort out and domestic industrial structure doesn't matter. In East Asia, the understanding of the purpose of the government has always been much more expansive. But in the West, we've had a very, very narrow view of what it's appropriate for the government to do. So meeting this challenge, this comprehensive national security challenge, now requires a fundamental rethinking of the role of the government. In its core, this national security challenge is a challenge of mindset, a shift in understanding of what governments can and should do. Of course, not displacing markets, but acting strategically behind the border, not at the border, to build those capabilities in ways that allow us to still benefit from the enormous security-enhancing opportunities of international trade and investment, but without undermining our domestic capabilities.
I come here every summer to feel the changes of the world in person. Instead of catching up, China is now on the front line of innovation and opening up. And the conversation taking place here are changing. And I am meeting those that you really don't want to miss. On AI, supply chains, innovation, and trade. To understand the world better in order to tell what's ahead for you. Join me in Dalian for AM&C 2026. Two parts to this statement that you just make, which I think very interesting. On the one hand, the governments are exercising, their learning curve, so to speak, around the world. We should give them time. It's only sensible that we're giving them time, just like everything else. But on the other hand, how much time should we give them? And how much will policies, change the overall landscape that we are talking about here today? How much businesses have to lose in order to let the governments, so to speak, or the policymakers become more matured or more capable? And meanwhile, how much does it take to see the overall picture as the picture is always evolving? These are wonderful questions coming out of the important opinions that you just shared. I would like to go to you, Yue, on that too. Your thoughts on that?
So unpredictability is going to be an enduring feature of the world, both for governments and companies alike. But
the question is, should we just let it be, or should we do something, right?
Yes, they will absolutely have to do something, right? But the key for governments and companies to do the right thing has a lot to do with their time horizon, whether they think short term or long term. And one of the key challenges of our times is that increasingly our time horizon is getting short, both for governments and even for companies, because companies are under constant pressure to deliver quarterly. Right? So within a company, do you do just in time or do you do just in case? If you do just in case, it doesn't contribute to your profit, but Mr. Sasaki will be the expert on that. So that's my impression. But which is to say that if you invest a lot of effort in resilience, in insurance, your shareholders, your stakeholders will ask, what's the payoff? Show me the evidence. And it is the same for governments as well. In order for governments to adapt to unpredictability, they need to have the patience to plan for the long term. So that even if short-term actions seem to be costly, they will pay off in the long term. So China's investment in clean energy is one example. In the beginning, it was expensive, wasn't clear it was going to pay off. But when the Iran conflict broke out, China had a much more diversified energy base than if it had never started on the clean energy revolution. Right? So you need to have this long time horizon in order to cope with unpredictability so that you're not excessively distracted by the daily noise up and down, but you have your sights on the pattern in the long term and really build your policies in a cumulative way toward that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to say that, from the just in time to the just in case. I think that I love that phrase. But my sense, even in the just in case, there should be the way the companies can make that excess margin. I mean, it's not just the cost. And then there should be, because I'm a strong believer of the entrepreneurship of the business community. They will do, I think, even under the stressful situation, they will find a way to get that excess margin. That's a business. That's a spirits, animal spirits. And then, of course, I mean, I'm in the camp that I think quarterly basis earning call that too much. I think I agree. But the 1 year is good or 2 years is good. I have no answer.
Yeah.
So optimal point, business leader through that negotiation, I think they'll find a way of the solution. Then, in order to enhance that condition, that foundation, how much government can cooperate? I think that is a settling point that the relationship between the private sector and government side. Too much of the intervention may damage that the animal spirits, but just a laissez-faire may not be enough. I think that's quite clear. So then I think that discussion, the healthy dialogue between government, public sector, and the private sector, ongoing dialogue, would be critical. I think that in this age.
We haven't tried to do strategic industrial policy since the 1980s, and that wasn't very successful at that point, and it delegitimized the whole enterprise. Obviously, a few years ago when we started experimenting with this new approach, we really tried to import policy tools from overseas, like production tax incentives, really mirroring what was done with the European New Deal or, the Inflation Reduction Act in America, because we didn't have this industrial policy muscle. We weren't sure of what to do. Those policies haven't worked. And in the recent government budget, a lot of those policies have been done away with. But importantly, what the government hasn't done away with is the goal. So we're now keeping the goal, but experimenting with a new suite of much more domestically attuned, task-appropriate policies focused on both domestic capability building but also market creation with Japan, with Korea, with China, about standard setting, about collective demand creation, about mandates. So I think it's this kind of learning that is really important, but it speaks to this problem of will governments get the opportunity? Will early failure delegitimise and open the way for those who wouldn't like the goal of the green energy transition to happen to kind of politicise that and argue for a reversion to the fossil fuel order of the past?
What exactly should be the role of businesses as we see things are evolving?
How to grasp the future, I think, should be in the hands of the leaders and CEOs. Leaders are quite responsible, I think, in this age, because everything is unpredictable. And how to collaborate with the government, how to collaborate with other business leaders, I think that dialogue, I mean, of course, they are doing the brutal competition in the day-to-day business. But at the same time, think about that, just a mid to long-term basis. Yeah. How to find the right optimization, I think that will be the role, yeah.
As we speak, we were talking about this in the green room. There's one supply chain expo going on in Beijing as we speak right here. Thousands of companies are participating from all over the world, including in some of the so-called sensitive areas of industry, chips, and the list goes on. And they are talking to one another.
That's exactly the animal speech. I think that they try to optimize themselves, and then but that will create that the unity, and then I think to maximize the total benefit. That's a way. But I think, as I said, just a complete laissez-faire, that may not be the case, but the right coordination across the business leaders with the public sector, I think that will be the key solution in this age. Yeah.
And of course, the public participation.
Public participation is quite...
They want both the security and good life at the same time.
I'm not concerned about that cooperation between private and government, because they are rational to some extent. But I do worry about the cooperation across the government, to be honest. But that's not my field, so...
Related to the competition, I was doing some interviews, of course, over the past few years on AI. And some industry experts have been talking to me, and I would love to quote him right now. He said, there should be more great competition between businesses, among businesses. But there should not be competition among governments for having more regulations than one another, especially toward one another. So that's an interesting quote I got from policy, from business and also industry experts. Elizabeth, your thoughts on that?
Competition between governments in some respects isn't necessarily a bad thing. If we look at the countries, for example, that have delivered some of the most incredible transformative economic development experiences. So at the end of World War II, Japan, Korea, these governments were in large part driven by an incredible desire to catch up with the West. That is an inherently competitive drive, and it was an enormously productive drive, and it wasn't seen through a zero-sum lens. And I think, coming back to this open door, closed door analogy, this was a way, a kind of positive, if we look to Japan, we look to Korea, a kind of positive economic nationalism, whereby these governments were very much focused on the question of how to transform the industrial structure of the nation and how to lift millions of people out of poverty in a very quick time. And that was done through a kind of managed openness, in a way. So it was about acknowledging that there are enormous gains to be made through trade. Exporting is hugely important. Right. And if you want to export, you have to maintain an open market as well. There are enormous gains to be made from foreign investment. There are enormous gains to be made from technology transfer. But the question is how you put the guardrails in place to ensure that that doesn't spill over into negative domestic, social and economic consequences.
The thoughts of autarky has created a fragmentation of the supply chains all over the world we have seen, but this time also fall on the issue of artificial intelligence. And yet, the further it is down that road, we are seeing more danger of autarky. This is like a vicious cycle that we are talking about. So what is the best ingredient right now, knowing the danger of autarky, and therefore taking advantage of the tools of AI to put at least a pause?
Geoeconomic tools is really a big power luxury. Only very few countries can deploy these kinds of tools. And so the relevant policy for the rest of the world is how do you build internal resilience, internal absorptive capacity to deal with the shocks of being integrated.
I think the appeal of self-sufficiency or insurance or autarky would go down if people felt safer, and to the extent that governments and societies can do things to reduce the risks that make people want to have that self-insurance, that would be better for everyone.
While we're very much focused at the moment on geostrategic security concerns, and this is driving this autarkic turn, if you like, that national security is much broader. It's not just about military security, it's about economic and energy and environmental and social security. And across this comprehensive security dimension, you cannot maximise those with a closed economy. The existential challenge is climate change. That cannot be addressed by any country acting alone. So it's a prosperity, comprehensive prosperity is about productive collaboration.
Healthy discussion with the multiple layers, government, private sectors, I think that will be the starting point. That's why we are here. I really could refresh my own thinking by having this discussion. But that is a starting point. Unless we have the right understanding with others, we'll never be able to reach that, the cooperation consensus. Yeah.
One thing I have learned from all our capable panelists today is not to reach conclusion too soon. There are a lot of efforts that need to be made in order to make things better, arguably, for everyone. I want to thank all of you for your contribution and your insights. Really appreciate it. This has been a joint production of World Economic Forum and CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. Thank you for being with me and our panelists. Appreciate it. Thank you.